How much to charge for that gig? It's kind of the age-old question, right? Well, I'm going to give you three ways to think about that today. I have been a full-time performer, self-employed since 1992, so I've used a lot of these and I've seen a lot of them in practice. So here we go. We should start by noting that nobody can give you an exact dollar amount in terms of what you should be charging. There's just too many variables. Where do you live? What's the going rate there? Who's hiring you? And what's their budget like? And how much do they pay other performers? What kind of gig is it? Are people buying tickets? Are you entertaining a built-in crowd? So there's just way too many factors. No one can give you an exact number, but here are three ways to approach it. So the first approach is definitely where I started and maybe where you have as well. And it's all about taking what you can get, right? Either the venue tells you, well, we pay our performers X amount, or maybe they ask you what you charge and the paranoia factor sets in where you're afraid of losing the gig, so you end up underselling yourself. We've all been there. Some people stay there, and for some people that's fine. I mean, if you're the kind of person that doesn't need to be generating a lot of income from performing, you could stay there for the rest of your life, and that works absolutely fine. Maybe you perform simply to bring other people joy or to get more experience as a live performer. Nothing wrong with any of that. Some of my full-time professional colleagues will complain about you because there's this feeling that people who can play for cheap or for free are bringing down the whole market, and then no one wants to pay any money. I'm not in that school. I think there are a lot of different reasons why people perform music publicly, and if working for a little bit of money it works for you, great. If not, then I think you're probably ready to move into approach number two, which is exactly what happened for me. Once I got married, once I had kids, once I bought a house, all of a sudden I could not afford to be doing those kinds of gigs anymore. And I learned that pretty quick, and I'm going to show you what I did, and you can do the same exact exercise. I basically took a piece of paper and I wrote down a figure in terms of how much money I needed to be making per month from my music. Once I looked at that figure, it became very clear to me that I could no longer afford to be playing, little coffee house gigs for $75 or giving guitar lessons out of my house, which back in the 90s, I think I started at $12 an hour, and maybe I got up to $20 an hour, but none of that was going to work anymore. I was not going to be able to meet my income goals. So what that did for me is it launched me into a whole different realm of performing. So for you, maybe what that means is pursuing weddings or other kinds of work that you're aware of that pay better. For me, what it meant was moving almost all my musical activity for some 20 years into educational performing. So taking my music and bringing it into schools, for instance, K-12 schools, and performing for kids where there are very substantial budgets set aside for this kind of activity. Other grant-funded kind of work, performing in libraries, performing in arts centers and community centers where they have a pool of money to hire performers. Now, a few things to think about with this approach, because you're going to be asking significantly more money, I'm guessing. You want to think about the volume of work you can handle. Are you able to go play 20 some days out of every month? Are you young enough, enthusiastic enough, fit enough, is your car working well enough to go do that much work? If you can, then you can probably price yourself on the lower end of this sort of new professional scale and just make up the difference in quantity of work. If you're not able to do that much work in a month, let's say you can envision yourself playing 10 to 15 times a month, then of course you're going to need to raise your rates higher still in order to meet your monthly income goal. You're going to need some days out of every week to manage the business end of this, because all of a sudden you're in the booking role, you're in the administrative role, there are contracts and emails to return and phone calls. So I can't go out and perform 30 days a month. I can only perform about half that number of days because I need a substantial amount of time for administrative stuff, which is not the fun stuff, obviously, but it's the stuff that needs to happen. And another thing to think about is you're definitely going to lose some gigs. Once you start quoting this higher money, some people might be used to the way you used to price yourself. In some of these new markets you will be pursuing, maybe your price strikes them as high, maybe it doesn't, but you're not always going to get the gig. And you will definitely be too expensive for some people. But the way to think about that is are those the gigs you can afford to be doing anyway? If you're too expensive for them, it means they can't afford you and what you're now needing to make and what you're asking. So I would encourage you to stick with your guns, and you will lose some gigs in the short term, but think about those gigs as the ones that really aren't going to provide you with a sustainable living. Now, there's a third approach, which was put together by a friend of mine, a fellow performer named Chris Holder. And Chris took this whole rational approach several steps beyond where I took it. And I have not taken my own income needs to this level of detail, but this might appeal to you even more so than my approach. What Chris decided to do is he got out that same piece of paper. He wrote down his yearly income goal. What do I need to be bringing in through my music? He said, I then added a third more to that for expenses, for gas, for tolls, for equipment. On top of that, you need to think about what you're going to need for health insurance, for liability insurance, for sick days, and for holidays, because obviously we don't get paid for any of that, right? On top of that, he said he'd like to reinvest 5% of that original amount back into the business and back into his art. And then, of course, we have federal and state taxes, which are going to differ in terms of percentage from state to state and region to region, but that's another thing you need to add in there. So by the time you've added all these things together, you're probably at a number that's approaching double what you actually need to net as income for the year. So he said, then take that total amount, divide it by the number of days that you are able and willing to work in a year. So let's say you can work 150 days out of the year, and the other days you're going to need for sick time, for holidays, for weekends, for administrative work. And so you divide that number by the number of days you're able to work, and that's going to be what you need to be making on a daily basis. Now, would that change the kinds of gigs that you do and the kinds of money you ask for? Absolutely, 100%. I'm going to leave you with one more big thing to think about, and that is this. Our price says a whole lot about our perceived value. So in other words, if we're charging the same low amount that other performers are charging, that means that's who we see ourselves as being. And one musician once said, you're never going to be worth more than you ask for, right? And conversely, if there's a big sticker price on our performance, it says a few things to the person that's considering hiring you. Even if they can't afford it right now, it tells them, wow, well, this person must get that money in other places. B, there is a perceived value to that dollar amount, like, well, these guys must be really good if they charge this amount of money. And I've had this happen over and over where someone has approached me for a performance. I've quoted them a price. They couldn't meet my price, and I've said, no worries, I hope we can get together on it in the future. And lo and behold, they come back a year later, 2 years later, and they've actually secured the money through grant funding or some other source to have me come in. Now, why would they do that if they're used to paying less? Well, that number, there's a few reasons, but that price, that number I quoted them sticks in their mind, and they think, well, this guy charges more than the other people. There must be something there. He must be better. Of course, you have to deliver on that. Once you go and do the gig, you have to be worth every penny of what you're asking. So I hope that's given you a whole lot to think about, and definitely drop a note in the comments if you have questions or alternate viewpoints. I'd love to hear them, and we can keep the conversation going.